I'm back to read Polaris again, and I am at chapter 18, Turn for the Worse. They carried their heavy loads up the sloping ladder and dropped them on the deck. Owen emerged last in line, still pointing the now empty pistol down in the darkness. He had forgotten he'd already fired his shot, wondered Emma, or was he hoping that Ob had forgotten how to count to one somewhere along the way to becoming a monster? "What is it?" called Maria from her post. "What did you see?" "A beast," Aaron answered. "The walking remains of old Macy," added Thatcher. "Nothing good," concluded Owen. Henry said nothing, and Emma could see his mind was still working, still chewing away at the bizarre sight. What has he seen, she wondered. Does he alone know? She turned to her sister and shook her head, her message somewhere between "I have no idea" and "you don't want to know." Then she swung around to help batten down the hatch. As soon as the cover was on, they loaded it up with a heavy object within reach. Not just a rope this time, but also a certain wooden blocks that those ropes slid through, and other bits of equipment. For the moment, Emma wondered if they could drag one of the anchors over. She started off the heavy metal cables holding them to the ship, and that's when she saw the forward hatch. Save some of the ballast," she said, pointing at it. They loaded that one down, too. After they planted an old pot of dried tar on top, Aaron grabbed the ship's cat and plopped her down amid the clutter. "Don't let anything get up, Duffy," he instructed. Daffodil hissed at him and took off at a run for the captain's cabin. "We'll have to guard it ourselves," said Owen. "That one doesn't have the claws for it." He paused, remembering what they'd just seen. "We need a lion." He looked down at his pistol and followed the cat into the cabin to reload. Thatcher followed a few steps behind. At first, Emma didn't think much of it, but then it occurred to her where he might be going. She fell in line a few paces back. Thatcher took the 3 little steps to the quarterdeck briskly. A few minutes later, Emma did the same, her bare feet quiet on the well-worn wood. Just a few days earlier, it would have been unthinkable for a ship's boy, much less a ship's girl, to set foot on this grave terrain without permission. Now they did it in barely a second thought. Thatcher stopped short alongside the wheel. Emma nodded grimly behind him. She'd been right. "I'll take over," Thatcher told Maria. "Your trick's up by now." Maria shifted her gaze from the ocean ahead to the boy beside her. She looked over her shoulder at her sister. Thatcher followed her gaze and turned. He jumped slightly, his nerves worn as thin as everyone else's. "What are you doing up here?" he said. "It's not your turn," said Emma flatly. "You're not even on the same watch." "What's it to you?" he said, already turning away and stepping toward the wheel. "Some time at the helm will calm my nerves, is all." "But is that all?" Emma wondered. Thatcher put a hand on the wheel, grabbing one of the spokes and swinging it around. He seemed willing to shoulder Maria out of the way, but before he could, she released the wheel and stepped aside. "Fine with me," she said, looking straight into Emma's eyes. She added, "We need to talk anyway. I want to know what happened down there. I heard the gunshot." Emma took one more look at Thatcher, standing tall and looking diligent enough at the wheel. Then she looked back at her sister. "Fine," she said, "but you will not like it." The sisters turned and headed forward, leaning in and talking now. Emma struggled to find the words, in English, Spanish, or anything else, that might spring to mind to describe the horror she'd seen beneath the grating. Maria refused to believe that she had heard, interrupting with, "Are you sure?" And, "No. It's very hard to see clear down there." As they descended from the quarterdeck, the cabin's door slapped open behind and the shouting started. "What are you doing?" bellowed Owen. "Have you lost your senses?" "On the contrary," Thatcher called back. "I have found them." Emma glanced down at his hands and saw them pulling hard to the left. The moment later, the big ship answered, pitching over to the side as its course changed. "That rat," she thought. She knew he'd been up to something. Owen stepped forward, but Thatcher refused to even look in his direction. He was steering hard left, straight toward the nearest land, straight toward Central America. She knew because she had briefly considered doing the same thing. "I am taking her straight to shore," yelled Thatcher. "I care not where." "You will not," growled Owen. Suddenly, the two boys were side by side. There were 4 hands on the wheel instead of 2. "Let him do it," called Aaron. She turned to see the others gathered beside on the lip of the quarterdeck, watching the wrestling match for the control of the wheel. Emma's eyes flickered down toward the reloaded pistol stuck into Owen's belt. It was all too familiar, the anger and shouting and the heavy tang of possible violence. A word floated into her mind that she refused to say it, or even think it. Then another occurred to her. She looked up to the canvas, and the wind was stronger now. She spun and looked towards the ship's bow. "The sails!" she shouted. The sailing ship was guided as much as its sails as its wheel. You couldn't just make it hard turns willy-nilly without taking the corresponding changes to the sails. She searched her eyes for those around her who would help her. She looked back toward the wheel, her eyes pleading for some sort of order. What she saw was calmed her nerves, at least for a moment. Bigger and stronger, Owen simply overpowered Thatcher for control of the wheel. Once the smaller boy's hands were free of the spokes, Owen shouldered him aside. Thatcher hesitated, then stepped clear. The tension faded and Emma exhaled. It had been a mutinous moment, or nearly so, but it had passed. Thatcher had no stomach for a losing battle. Slowly and steadily, with his eyes on the horizon, Owen began to steer the ship back to starboard. "The sails are in order," he said, "though we won't be needed those royals up in this wind." He peeled his eyes from the sails and looked down at the assembled crew. "We have seen horrible things this day, but either ran from the gun or fell from this blast. Perhaps it lies dead already." It, thought Emma. It had pulled that trigger. It wouldn't say his name. I wouldn't say his name either. She remembered the scene and tried to reconcile Owen's boastful tone with his shaking hand then. "Either way," she continued, "I will have no more talk of this ridiculous business. The nearest port," he repeated to phrase, spitting out in disdain. "The nearest port? Do you have any idea where we are in the world?" He stared at Aaron, then looked back at Thatcher. "These are wild ports, full of slavers and pirates. Wild ports and foreign. 6 children alone? The ship would be sold out from under us in a moment, and then we would be sold in turn. Sold, or worse." His eyes found Emma and her sister. It was a fierce look, and she felt a stutter run through her. He opened his mouth to say something more. Emma feared that it might be what it might be. What dire threat or prediction? Instead, Owen closed his mouth and shook his head. "What of the government of wherever this land is," said Henry, his voice is a peep. Owen seemed not to hear him, or at least not to acknowledge him. Emma answered instead. "Who do you think would take the ship?" Henry gazed back at her, shocked. For a moment she envied him for how soft his upbringing been, that he had no idea how the world worked out here in the wide seas beyond New York or Boston or wherever this frail boy had been hatched. But it was a harmless question, and Henry stood beside her, still considering the implications of her words. She leaned in to ask him one with a bit more bite. "You know what that was down there, don't you?" she said into the whipping wind. "I saw it in your eyes." Henry looked over at her. She could see how those eyes were watering. She hoped it was from the stiff salt breeze. He met her gaze. "It was—" He began before pausing to find the right word, and despite his strange frailty, or maybe because of it, she had no doubt he would use the right one. "It was a transformation," he said. She nodded. The word was almost the same in Spanish. Transformación. He continued. "2 separate species are somehow—" "Somehow what?" interrupted Maria. "What are you 2 talking about?" She was leaning in, whispering too. Secrets, Emma knew, were among her sister's favorite thing, even if she's not so great at keeping them. "Stow that grub!" Owen shouted from the wheel, shattering the quiet shared moment. We've got rough seas ahead, and we don't want to lose any of it overboard." The sky was darkening behind the ship, and the wind was picking up again. Whatever was coming, it would be no passing squall this time. "We'll need to take it in some sail," Emma called back as the first drops of rain began to fall. She heard them on the deck and felt them in her matted hair. Owen, Thatcher, and the rest of the crew turned to look at the ominous sky, each one of them with weather eye, trying to gauge how much time they had before the storm struck. There was nothing like foul weather to bring a crew together. As they gazed skyward, a huge gust of wind struck the ship from the southwest, once again well in advance of the looming clouds. The sails stretched forth and aft, and the timber groaned, and the ship was knocked nearly on its side. "It crept up on us," called Aaron. "Sneaky devil." Emma fell to one knee and to keep her balance. Henry, with the weakest sea legs, hit the deck beside her, rolling and tumbling toward the rail. She wondered, with a strange dreaminess, what that sometimes accompanies mortal danger, if that was the last she would see of him. For in a world with monsters and slavers, a world where no port was truly safe, there was still no quicker or surer death than that offered by the foul weather at sea. The gust had come from out of the blue and would have vanished into the graying one. As the wind relented, the ship righted herself, but as it rolled back to something like level, the waves slapping against the hull were already growing. "It's coming up fast," Owen called from the wheel. "We can ridge its edge. Stay ahead of it." And for a while it worked. The wind increased steadily with only occasional gusts, none like the sudden wallop that had nearly swamped them. Emma held on tight to the rail and looked at the state of things. The hatches were battened down and then some, and they had covered the gratings. The mainmast was missing its big mainsail, and the trysail was puffed aft, and the foremost was wearing plenty of canvas. The sailcloth was quickly soaked, turning a darker gray, and the sky scored above them, and the rain began to pour down in the buckets. But wet sails hauled wind well, and if nothing else cracked or split, she thought they might just be able to stay ahead of the worst of it until the storm blew itself out or passed them by. "We're going to make it," she shouted through the whistling wind to her sister just a few feet away. She smiled crazily in a simple thought of survival, but her sister was not smiling back. She was looking straight ahead. Emma whipped her head around. "Oh no," she murmured, her words eaten alive by the wind. What she saw was the big ship sliding down the back of a long swell. "Hold on," she yelled, and not just to her sister this time. The bow slammed hard into the waiting sea, punching through like a spoon into soup. Emma felt her head whipped forward. A moment later, a wave of seawater flooded across the deck as the ship rose back up from the face of the next swell. But it didn't rise as high as it had before, and when it slid down the back of it, it dove even deeper. Emma watched in both horror and recognition as the long bowsprit at the front of the boat harpooned the water. As the boat rose again, it brought with it a heavy load of seawater that rolled down the deck in a great frothy wave. And again, the boat rose up, only to be driven down, and again, and again. Each time it rose up less, it was driven down more, grasping the rail with sore, wet hands, as another wave threatened to carry her away. Emma stared at the sails once more, and this time she saw the problem. The topmost royals had already been reefed, and it wasn't enough. They were still wearing too much sail, and in the wrong places. "It's burying us," she called back to Owen. "It's driving us under." But Owen was being tossed around at the wheel like a rag doll, and it was all he could do to keep hold of the thing and keep the ship pointed forward. If they turned crosswise to these seas, they would be finished. Emma peeled one hand of the rail and grabbed her sister's arm. "This rig is all wrong," she shouted, slapping her hand back into the rail. "Too front heavy." Maria's eyes grew wide as she looked up. With the mainsail stripped bare and missed, the foremast was carrying most of the sail. Now the strong storm winds were filling those forward sails and driving them down into the sea, and it was slowing them down, allowing the worst of the storm to catch up. Emma was sure it would sink them. As if to confirm her fears, she heard the shout from Owen and looked back to see that he had lost control of the wheel, which was spinning wildly in the sight. When she looked back at Maria, she staring at her, shaking her head. "Don't do it. You can't lay aloft in this." "I have to," she called. "I have to take in some of the sail up high." As the boat began to turn sideways, the swell's huge waves smashed against the hull, spraying seawater across the deck. As the rest of the wave passed beneath the ship, the port side rose high in the air, and Emma heard a sickening crack. It sounded like a breaking bone. It was almost as loud as a gunshot. Wet wood giving way. One of the port side cannons had broken free. Larger ships, she knew, kept their cannons below deck, and a loose cannon could easily sink them. But the Polaris was too small for that. Her cannons were kept on deck, and now one of them had broken free of its moorings. Emma watched. It careened across the tilted deck. It smacked into the opposite lumber on the starboard side with a deafening metal clack. Both cannons and much of the railings around them plunged overboard into the rolling sea. The ship was tearing herself apart. Emma had to act now. Without too much of a glance back at her sister, she began making her way, hand over hand, along the railing. "Don't!" called her sister, but Emma didn't look back. She looked up. The high-flying royals had already been furled on both masts, but it wasn't enough. More needed to be taken in. She skirted past Thatcher on the rail. "We need to take in the 4 top gallants, at least, and reef the topsail," she called to him. He looked up. Heavy, wet canvas, whipping the snapping in the wind. "That's no job for a girl," he shouted back. "Not a job for a boy, either," Aaron called from the spot, hugging the mainmast, and sure enough, neither of them took as much as one soggy step forward. Emma shook her head in annoyance, and resumed her spider walk along the pitching rail. Thatcher reached out and grabbed her arm. "If we go down," he bellowed, and a mechanical smile spreading across his face, "we take that thing down with us." Not willing to take his other hand off the rail, he nodded down at the dark space below the deck. She had heard something like this before, the idea of mutual destruction of a sort of the victory. She wondered once again why it held such a lure for the males of her species. She shook free of the grasp. "We are not sinking," she shouted. "Not if I can help it." The boat began to swing back around, and she realized, without looking back, that Owen had regained control of the wheel. "Keep her straight, Owen," she called. She doubted he could hear her through all of this, but lightning flashed, and she was sure he could see as she took a deep breath and hoisted herself up on the rail, slicked ratlines of the foremast. The wind whipped in around her, and she climbed, and she driving rain slammed and slapped against her skin. Many times, one foot slipped, or another hand was tugged nearly free. If both happened at once, she knew which she would be flung to the deck or the sea below, a crushing death or a watery one. The higher up she went, the worse it got. The wind grew harder and louder, and the motion of the ship was amplified by the level of the mast. But what could she do? She kept climbing. The sheer familiarity of the motion calmed her some. She had always been good at this. Soon the shrouds narrowed, and she reached the top gallant yard. Without hesitation, she slid along the treacherous wooden spit, her calloused feet gripping the foot rope beneath her, and surely as any monkey had ever gripped a vine. And then, the tempest swirling all around her, with the lightning flashing above, she began gathering in heavy wet canvas. At first it was too much, but she learned a thing or two recently. She removed the knife from the sheath. Then she reached down as much as Owen had done and gashed the taut canvas. The wind instantly pushed through the wounds and turning them into slapping sounds. She leaned out and all but filleted the upper stretches of the sail, and the wind pushed through, and she heard the canvas begin to tear further. A bit of the pressure relieved, she began to haul in and wound the sail, timing her tugs to the light hulls of the between gusts. She tied up her gains when she could, and creating what looked like belt loops in the canvas. It was a nearly superhuman feat. One girl against all the sail in the teeth of the gale. But even small bodies are capable of great strength in times of crisis. Manuela Iglesias understood what needed to be done, and grabbing fistfuls of wet canvas and dodging its slapping edges, she did it. Soon, though she could not say how soon, her aching arms, bleeding hands were tying knots she knew by heart, securing the top gallant sail tight to the yard. She was already nearly spent when she descended to the forward topsail. It was lower down in the yards, but a bit thicker, but the sail itself was larger and heavier. She was sure she would be impossible by herself, but this one she would not have to battle alone. As she was climbing down, she saw her sister, her long black hair whipping wildly around her, climbing up to join her, and just a few steps behind Maria, Thatcher appeared, his weary frame hunched like a baboon, his face grim in the death he thought he was climbing toward, and behind him Aaron, too, had joined their mad bid to save the ship. It still wasn't much for four undersized sailors in a tempest, but they were used to working these sails together now. Even under these extreme conditions, they moved in unison. They held on for dear life during the worst of the dips and gusts and jolts, and in a moment later, they'd be hauling as one once again. At the times, they achieved a perilous sort of leverage to pulling as the ship climbed the steep waves, adding their own body weight to what their muscles could manage. Working as a team, they took in as much of the topsail canvas as they dared, tied it off, and descended back to the pitching deck. Emma looked back toward the helm, where Owen was gripping the wheel with everything he had, and then up at the canvas. Have we taken in enough? But already she could see that the ship's bow was riding higher, skipping over the worst of the waves, rather than diving down into them. Behind them, the stout little trysail was doing more of the work. Even without its mainsail, the mainmast was still catching plenty of wind, and in the teeth of the storm, there was plenty of wind to catch. Above them, the foremast was doing its share, and no more. Thank God, Emma thought. Her knees felt ready to buckle, and her eyes ready to close. Every last bit of her strength had been spent. But as tired as she was, she still had one more thing to do. She waited for Thatcher to sink past her, then reached out and grabbed him hard by the shirt. If you tell me one more time it is not a job for a girl, I will do to you what I did to that top gallant, she said flatly. Do you understand me? Thatcher's eyes grew wide. His mouth dropped open, but no words came out. Instead, he nodded slowly. Once, twice, 3 times. On the third, Emma released his shirt and went to find some place to sit down. The Polaris and her young crew rode the edge of the storm for another 2 hours before the worst of it passed them by off their port side. They all but flew over the waves, making grand time. By and by, the sky lightened, and just before dusk, the sun broke through, winking at them from the low horizon before sinking away. All right, that was a long chapter, but they survived another storm. We'll see what happens in the next chapter tomorrow.